April 14th, 1941, a little after 5 in the morning, the desert west of a small Libyan port called Tobruk. Lieutenant Joachim Schorm of the 5th Panzer Regiment is inside the enemy fortress, and it is going wrong. His tanks have done everything they were built to do. In the dark, they found the gap in the wire. They crossed the anti-tank ditch. They rolled straight past the forward infantry posts and pushed deep into the perimeter, exactly as the manuals promised, exactly as it had always worked before. Schorm is an officer of the finest armoured force on earth. In less than 2 years, that force has beaten every army sent against it, and it has never once been stopped. The method is always the same. The tanks break through and the defenders break with them, except these defenders have not broken. The ground around him is coming apart. Anti-tank guns he cannot see are firing into the flanks of his tanks. Some of them are already burning. And behind him, in the posts his armour has supposedly overrun, the enemy infantry has not thrown up its hands and has not run. They have let the tanks roll past them, and now they are destroying everything that tries to follow. In his diary that night, Schorm will describe the place he is driven into with 3 words: a witch's cauldron. He does not understand it. And for the rest of the war, the men who sent him will struggle to understand it too. Every army that had met this method had folded. This one would not. The question this whole story turns on is a single word: why? This is not a story about a nickname. This is a story about what happens when an army that has conquered a continent by moving fast collides with men who have simply decided that they will not move at all. Part 1. To understand what Schorm was looking at, you have to go back, not to the start of the Desert War a few weeks earlier, but to the 2 years before it, to the campaigns that had taught the German army exactly what victory was supposed to look like. In September of 1939, German armour had overrun Poland in 5 weeks. In the spring of 1940, it had done the thing the world believed impossible, and beaten France, the strongest land power in Europe, in 6. Their whole philosophy of command rested on an idea best translated as mission command. You told junior officers what to achieve, and you trusted them to work out how. On the battlefield, that meant speed. You gathered your tanks at a single point, you punched a hole, and you drove into the enemy's rear before he could react. A defensive line, however strong on the map, became meaningless the moment you were behind it. Fear did the rest. An army that suddenly finds enemy tanks between itself and home tends to surrender, or run. In February of 1941, the officer sent to carry that method into North Africa stepped off a plane in Tripoli, Erwin Rommel. He was not yet the legend he would become, but he was already the most aggressive commander Germany possessed. Within weeks he had disobeyed his orders to stand still, attacked with a force barely unloaded from its ships, and chased the British more than 800 kilometres back across the Libyan desert. It was the fastest advance anyone had managed in the war so far. Everything was collapsing in front of him, exactly as it had collapsed in Poland and in France, and then he reached Tobruk. Tobruk was worth having. It held the only deep-water harbour for hundreds of kilometres in either direction, and Rommel was a general who desperately needed a port. Every litre of fuel and every shell his army burned had to be dragged overland from Tripoli, along a single ribbon of coast road, over a distance that swallowed supplies faster than his trucks could carry them forward. Capture Tobruk, and he had a working harbour a short drive from the front. Capture Tobruk, and the road to Egypt, to the Suez Canal, to the whole British position in the Middle East, lay open in front of him. He expected to take it in a single day. And here is the thing to understand about that expectation. It was not arrogance, it was arithmetic. Everything the war had taught him said that a beaten, retreating enemy, pinned against the sea inside a half-finished Italian fortress, would come apart at the first hard shove. His reasoning was not wrong about the war he had been fighting for 2 years. It was only wrong about the men who were now waiting for him behind the wire. Rommel would come to understand this in person. In a letter to his wife Lucy, written that same April, he described a column of Australian prisoners taken in the fighting. Big men, powerful men, who without any question, he wrote, were an elite formation of the British Empire. He had expected garrison troops guarding a supply dump. He had walked into something else entirely. Their method had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. It had worked the length of the Libyan coast. At Tobruk, for the first time in the entire war, it stopped working. And the reason it stopped is the whole of this story. Part 2. The thing that broke Rommel's method was not a secret weapon. It was a way of fighting, and it began with the man commanding inside the fortress. Leslie Morshead was a lieutenant general, a schoolteacher from New South Wales in the years before the war, and his own soldiers called him Ming the Merciless, after the villain from the Flash Gordon films, for the ferocity with which he drove them. When he took command of the garrison, he issued an instruction that set the tone for everything that came after. There would be no Dunkirk at Tobruk. If they were ever forced to leave, he told them, they would fight their way out, and there was to be no surrender and no retreat. Then he built a defence designed around a single unusual assumption. He assumed the tanks would get through. Most defensive doctrine tried to stop armour at the outer line. Morshead did the opposite. He told the infantry manning the perimeter to stay in their posts and let the German tanks roll right over the top of them and on into the interior. Once the armour was through, those same infantrymen would rise up and cut down the German infantry coming along behind, splitting the tanks off from the foot soldiers they needed. And waiting deeper inside, dug in and camouflaged, were the anti-tank guns and the field artillery, ready to kill the tanks now that they were alone, half-blind and unsupported. The German breakthrough, the very thing that had won Poland and France, was quietly converted into a trap. You let them in so that you could take them apart. There was a second half to Morshead's method, and it mattered just as much. He flatly refused to sit behind his wire and be besieged. Every single night he sent men out into no man's land to raid, to ambush, and to take prisoners, until the ground between the two armies belonged to the defenders rather than the attackers. He told a war correspondent that he intended to make no man's land our land. Slowly the besiegers became the ones who dreaded the dark. You could see both halves of it on the very night this story opened. The Germans had already dropped leaflets over the town, calling on the garrison to surrender while it still could, reminding them of a British force that had just been captured nearby at Machili. The garrison ignored them. Then, in the small hours before dawn on the 14th of April, a German machine gun battalion tore a hole in the wire. A small party of Australians from the 217th Battalion was sent forward to throw them back out. Among them was a corporal of 26, raised on a farm near Liverpool in New South Wales, named John Hurst Edmondson. Everyone called him Jack. The counter-attack went in with the bayonet. Edmondson was hit almost immediately, wounded in the neck and in the stomach. He kept going anyway. He was clearing Germans out of their newly captured positions when his own platoon commander was seized from behind and dragged down by two enemy soldiers. Edmondson, already dying on his feet, turned back, killed both of them, and saved the officer's life. The breach was sealed. A few hours later, Jack Edmondson was gone, dead of his wounds. For his actions that night, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for courage in the British Empire. It was the first Victoria Cross given to any Australian in the Second World War, and he had died without ever knowing he had earned it. The men on the other side simply could not account for what they were up against. A captured German soldier, quoted years afterward in an American study of the campaign, said the Australians fought like demons. In Poland and in France, he said, once the tanks were through, the infantry understood that the battle was lost and behaved accordingly. These men refused to understand it. The tanks got through, and the infantry just kept fighting. Men like Jack Edmondson, who spent the last hour of his life sealing a gap in the line so that the man beside him could live, are the reason this fortress held. If this video keeps his name in front of a few more people for a few more years, a single like is what does that. It costs you nothing, and it matters more than it should. Part 3. So where did it come from? Not the courage. Courage is universal. Every army has its share of it. Where did this particular way of fighting come from? This refusal to accept that a breakthrough meant the end? To find that, you have to look past the battlefield, at the kind of country that produced the men holding the perimeter. The Australians inside Tobruk, some 14,000 of them, were not a professional standing army. They were volunteers, nearly all of them, raised from a nation of only about 7 million people, and formed into the 9th Australian Division. They were tradesmen and clerks and farmhands and dock workers and shearers who had put up their hands after 1939, and most of them had never seen combat before the desert. What they carried instead of a long service was a particular temperament, an ingrained assumption that authority had to earn respect rather than simply demand it, and a deep practical instinct for improvisation, for making do with whatever happened to be lying around. In a parade ground army, that can be a liability. Cut off inside a siege and short of everything, it turned out to be exactly the right way to think. You can watch that instinct at work in one small example. When the garrison ran short of artillery, The defenders simply went and collected the guns the Italians had abandoned when the fortress first fell, dozens of them, and turned them back on their former owners. The crews were frequently not trained gunners at all. They were infantrymen, cooks and orderlies, taught the bare essentials by a handful of British regulars, firing captured weapons for which they had no manuals. They called it the bush artillery. By every rule, it should not have worked. It worked well enough to help hold a fortress for the better part of a year. Nobody had ordered that improvisation. It simply came naturally to men who had spent their whole lives fixing things for themselves. And what they endured in order to do it is genuinely hard to overstate. Tobruk in high summer climbed to 48 degrees Celsius. Water was rationed to roughly a bottle a day for everything a man needed, drinking and washing and cooking alike, and what there was came up brackish and always warm. There were flies in their millions and dust storms that buried food and choked engines. A long-range gun the men nicknamed Bardia Bill lobbed shells into the harbour from far beyond the perimeter. And above all of it, there were the bombers. Across the siege, German and Italian aircraft flew around 3,000 sorties against Tobruk in some 750 separate air raids, until it had become one of the most heavily bombed patches of ground anywhere on Earth. And through the whole of it, the harbour never once closed, because the harbour was the lifeline, and holding it open was a second hidden battle, fought almost entirely by the Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Navy. Night after night, small fast warships ran the gauntlet of the approaches the sailors had christened Bomb Alley, slipped in under cover of darkness, unloaded in a few frantic hours, and were gone again before daylight brought the aircraft back. They did this for months on end. Here is what that supply line carried into Tobruk over the course of the siege: 72 tanks, 92 guns, and 33,946 tons of stores, ammunition, food, and fresh water, right down to 108 live sheep. The price of delivering it was 27 warships sunk and as many again damaged. Sit with that for a moment. An entire fortress sealed off by land, kept breathing from the sea, night after night for the better part of a year, and paid for one sunken ship at a time. That is not courage in the abstract. That is an industrial nation and a professional navy deciding coldly and deliberately that this garrison would be kept alive and then paying the bill for it, ton by ton and hull by hull. If your father, your grandfather, or your great-uncle served at Tobruk, in the army, the navy, or the air force on any side of it, I would be honoured if you left his name and his unit down in the comments. These are the records that outlast every one of us. And here is the trap that Rommel could do nothing about. He had built his entire way of war on two things, movement and supply, and at Tobruk both had failed him at once. He could not take the harbour, so his own supply line stayed exactly as long as it had ever been, every shell and every drop of fuel still crawling up that single coast road from Tripoli, while the men he was besieging were being fed from the open sea at a rate he had no way to match. He could copy Australian courage, he could not copy the Royal Navy, and he could not conjure into existence a port he was unable to capture. The longer the siege lasted, the more it bled him, and the less it bled them. That is the deeper logic underneath everything. Tobruk did not merely hold. It held for 241 days, and every single one of those days cost the man outside the wire more than it cost the men inside it. Part 4. The realization, when it finally arrived, came first to the men at the very top, and it came in private. Rommel did not give up after the Easter fighting. At the end of April, on the 30th, he tried again, with a deliberate, carefully prepared assault by 2 divisions against a hill in the southwest of the perimeter, called Ras el Medawa. This time he took ground. His men seized a pocket around 5 kilometres wide, which the defenders would come to call the salient. And there the attack stalled, and then it stopped altogether. It stopped because the price had become impossible. By Rommel's own reckoning, that single operation cost him more than 1,200 men killed, wounded, and missing. He recorded grimly in his own account that this was exactly what happened when a war of movement congealed into a war of position. That position warfare was, in the end, a slow contest in the wearing away of men. It was the precise kind of war his entire method existed to avoid, and Tobruk had dragged him into it. Berlin had seen enough. The German High Command sent one of its most senior staff officers, General Friedrich Paulus, all the way out to the desert to see for himself what was going wrong. Paulus watched, took the measure of the exhausted Afrika Korps, and reported back that there was no realistic prospect of taking the fortress by storm. On his authority the order went out. There were to be no more full-scale assaults against Tobruk. Read that plainly. Barely 18 months into a war, it had been winning everywhere. The German army had been fought to a standstill on land and instructed in writing to stop attacking. It was the first time in the entire war that had happened, and the fortress he could not capture did far more than dent his reputation. For as long as it held out, it tied down German and Italian divisions he urgently needed elsewhere, and blunted the whole momentum of his advance, so that the brilliant drive he had begun back at Tripoli slowed and stalled in front of the one place he could not take. Here is what the German command was finally forced to admit to itself. It had been right about very nearly everything. It was right that Tobruk was the key to Egypt. It was right that a port that close to the front was worth almost any price. It was right that its army was, tank for tank and gun for gun, the most capable force in the theatre. What it had been wrong about was the single thing that turned out to matter most. It had assumed that a surrounded enemy, cut off and outgunned, would in time see reason and give way. These men would not give way. And an army that will not break cannot be defeated by the fear of encirclement, because it has already accepted encirclement as nothing more than the circumstance it happens to be in. That was true even when help from the outside failed to come. Twice, in May and again in June, British forces tried to fight their way through to Tobruk from Egypt, and both times they were beaten back. The garrison was left exactly where it had been, sealed in on its own for months longer. It went on holding anyway. Remember the platoon commander from that first night in April, the one the dying corporal turned back to save. His name was Austin McKell, a lieutenant of the 217th Battalion, and he lived. He came through that night on the wire, and he came through the siege, and he carried both of them for the rest of his life. Now take that one debt, one man alive because another chose that he should be, and multiply it by the thousands of men strung along that perimeter, each with a version of his own. That is what Rommel was actually fighting, not a line on a staff map, a web of men who had each decided on their own and together that they were simply not going to be the ones who broke. By this point the enemy had a name for them, and here is the part that history tends to get wrong. It had not come from Rommel at all. It came over the radio, out of Berlin's English-language propaganda broadcasts, read by the traitor the British had nicknamed Lord Haw Haw. He sneered that the garrison was trapped, that the men were living underground like rats, caught like rats in a cage. His exact words reach us only second-hand, from soldiers remembering them long afterward. But the garrison heard them, and did the one thing the propagandists never saw coming. They took the insult and they put it on. They began to call themselves the Rats of Tobruk. They struck their own mock medals in the shape of a rat, cut from the aluminum of a downed German aircraft. The word that had been chosen to shame them became the proudest thing they owned. Part 5. So, back to the question sitting underneath all of this. Why couldn't the most famous general of the war, at the very height of his powers, break the men he had surrounded? The answer is not that the Australians were braver than the Germans, or better men, or somehow harder. They were not. Courage was not in short supply on either side of that line. The answer is that the two armies were built around two completely different ideas of what war rewards. The German idea was speed. Concentrate, break through, get in behind the enemy, and let his collapse finish the job. It was brilliant, and it had already conquered a continent. The Australian idea, forced upon them by their situation, was endurance. Take the blow, absorb it, refuse to fold, and turn time itself into the weapon, because every day the siege lasted did more damage to the attacker than to the defender. The Germans had a method for winning quickly. The Australians had a method for not losing slowly. At Tobruk, for the first time, the second one beat the first. It is worth being honest about the limits of what they did. The Australians did not hold Tobruk on their own, and they would have been the first to insist on it. British gunners and tank crews, Indian soldiers, and later a Polish brigade and a full British division all held that perimeter as well. Many of the guns that killed the tanks were British. The ships that fed the fortress were the Royal Navy first and the Australian Navy second, and most of the 9th Division never even saw the siege lifted. Their own government pressed hard for them to be pulled out and rested, and across the second half of 1941 they were quietly withdrawn by sea and replaced, so that when the relief finally arrived, that December, only a single Australian battalion, the 213th, was still there to witness it. The men who made the legend had mostly gone before the ending was written, and it was paid for in full. Across the fighting of 1941, the Australians at Tobruk lost more than 800 men killed, more than 2,000 wounded, and over 900 taken prisoner. One of those 800 was the corporal from that first night on the wire. Remember them as they actually were, not supermen, not the marble figures on a war memorial. Ordinary men who found, with their backs to the sea and no way out, that they could not be moved. Remember Leslie Morshead, who convinced an army that a line could be held simply by deciding to hold it. Remember Austin McKell, who spent the rest of his years on the strength of a debt no ledger could ever record. Remember Jack Edmondson, who lies to this day in the war cemetery at Tobruk, in the ground he would not give up. And remember the name they made for themselves, out of an insult meant to break them, and then carried like a medal for the rest of their days. If you want the next chapter, and there are many more of these, more sieges, more generals, more men whose names deserve to outlast the ones who mocked them, then subscribe and stay with me. These stories only survive for as long as there is still someone willing to hear them.